Iron scrapes against stone, a rasping sound in the darkness, sharp and merciless. The flame of a single candle trembles against damp walls, its smoke curling into the stench of rot. And there, on a table stained by blood long dried, lies a man. Bound at the wrists, bound at the ankles, eyes wide, chest heaving. He whispers a prayer, not for healing, but for death. The figure who looms above him is no physician in white robes, no scholar of anatomy. He's a butcher in every sense but name. His apron stiff with gore, his hands calloused by years of sharpening blades. He lifts a rusty iron instrument into the candlelight, its edge jagged, already blackened by blood not yet his patient's own. This is not a hospital. This is not mercy. This is medieval surgery. The air itself feels suffocating, thick with sweat and terror. And as the iron is raised higher, the man on the table begins to scream. Not because he has been cut yet, but because he knows what is coming. This was the reality of healing in medieval Europe, a world where pain was not avoided but inflicted, where cures were worse than the wounds they sought to mend, where death was a release, and survival was often the greater curse. And if you, watching now, wish to journey deeper into these shadows, if you wish to uncover the truths history tried to bury, then take a moment to join our fellowship of seekers. Subscribe so you never miss the stories whispered only in fear and spoken now aloud. Because what comes next will change how you see medicine forever. The truth is this: in the Middle Ages, surgeons were rarely trained physicians. Most were barbers, executioners, or gravediggers, men who cut hair by day and cut flesh by night. They did not study anatomy in ivory towers. They learned on battlefields, in butcher stalls, in the back rooms of taverns. Their tools were cleavers, saws, and razors, meant for wood and bone alike. Imagine being led into such a chamber. The smell of old blood clinging to timber beams, flies gathering in the corners, a bucket placed beside you, not for water but to catch the severed piece of you soon to fall into it. No opium, no ether, no morphine, only the priest at your side whispering prayers while the blade descended. Here, screams were not accidents, they were the music of the operating table, for suffering was seen as proof of the body's corruption being purged. Every cry a testimony that the procedure was working, and yet these places were called theatres. As if the agony of the wounded was not enough, the procedures became performances. Spectators gathered, not to marvel at recovery, but to gape at mutilation. Flesh torn, bones splintered, bodies held down while hot iron seared wounds shut. This was the theatre of pain, not designed to heal, designed to endure. The patient on our table writhes as the knife meets skin. The cut is jagged, tearing more than slicing. Blood spills onto the floor, onto the surgeon's boots. The candle sputters in the damp air, the shadows dance, and the screams rise until they choke on themselves. But the surgeon does not falter. He's not disturbed by the wails. He is guided by them. Each convulsion, each sob, proof that the man is still alive, still enduring what no one should. And when the blade is finally withdrawn, when the hot iron cautery is pressed against the wound, filling the chamber with the smell of burning flesh, the man no longer prays for death. He begs for it. This was healing in the Middle Ages, not miracles of medicine, but rituals of suffering. A gamble where even survival left scars deeper than the wound itself. And yet, the worst was not the agony of the knife, but what happened afterward, when the wound itself became the real killer. The screams fade, but the memory of them lingers, thick in the air, like the smoke of a burnt offering. And as the patient's blood cools on the surgeon's hands, we must ask, who were these men, entrusted with the power of life and death? They were not physicians in robes of scholarship. They were not healers trained in anatomy secrets. They were butchers, barbers, executioners, the men society already entrusted with blades. In the bustling markets of medieval Europe, the barber's pole spun in the wind, a spiral of red and white. To the unknowing eye, it was a simple sign of hair and beard, but the red stripe, that was blood. The white, the bandages. For within the same shop where men came for a trim, others came to lose a tooth, to have a boil lanced, or, if fate was cruel, a limb severed. The barber's chair became the operating table, his razor still warm from a cheek, soon biting into flesh far more vital. And beside the barbers, there were battlefield scavengers. When war spilled thousands onto the mud, these men were not soldiers, but carrion crows. They followed the armies collecting the broken. Their craft learned not from study, but from necessity. Tie a stump, saw through the bone, cauterize with a heated blade, quick, brutal, and merciless. Then there were the monks, forced by duty, not choice, to stitch the wounded who arrived at monastery gates. Forbidden by canon law to shed blood, they lived in contradiction, souls bound to God, yet hands pressed into gore. Many stitched by candlelight, their knowledge of scripture outstripping their knowledge of veins and sinew. Faith their guide, not anatomy. In this strange division of labour, medicine itself fractured. In Latin universities, physicians draped in silk lectured on the balance of humours, quoting Galen and Hippocrates, rarely touching a body. Meanwhile, in the mud of the marketplace, barbers sawed through screaming flesh. Theory and practice lived in different worlds. The mind speculated, the hands butchered. Consider the most common procedures. A tooth, decayed and blackened, was no gentle extraction. Iron pliers were clamped, and with one savage twist the root was torn free, often shattering bone and gum with it. A broken limb was not reset but removed. The saw chewed through living bone, and the wound seared shut with a brand. The stench of burning marrow filling the room. A bladder stone, cut from below, was no delicate surgery, but an act of mutilation, leaving many patients crippled, incontinent, or dead within days. Pain was everywhere, and pain was expected. To suffer was to be cleansed. The Church itself taught that agony was a divine punishment, proof of sin, and therefore its endurance was holy. To be cut, to be burned, to scream in torment was not only tolerated, it was sanctified. The surgeon's cruelty found shelter under heaven's gaze. But survival did not belong to the surgeon. It belonged to the body. It was not skill that preserved life, but sheer resilience. Bones that knit despite infection, flesh that scarred despite neglect. Those who lived in spite of the knife, not because of it. And those who died were considered chosen by God, their suffering expiated in blood. Picture again the barber's stall, men queuing with purses of coin, knowing full well that behind the curtain lay screams. They did not walk in expecting comfort. They walked in expecting ordeal. The surgeon was not a healer, but an executioner of pain, wielding iron not to cure but to test. This was the age of butchers and barbers, a time when healing was indistinguishable from torment, when the barber's pole spun as a symbol of salvation, red stripes painted in blood. And yet, as horrifying as this was, worse still was coming. For when pestilence blackened Europe, when swollen buboes burst and the air itself carried death, the surgeon's table became something darker still. Not salvation, but a gamble with death. The year's 1348. Bells toll without ceasing, their iron tongues announcing not worship but death. The air is heavy, poisoned by the scent of rot and smoke from burning pyres. And through the narrow streets of Europe, Men in blood-stained aprons drag the sick into chambers that reek of both fear and desperation. The Black Death had come, and with it, the knife. Inside a dim room, a patient writhes, his neck swollen with buboes, purple and grotesque. The surgeon approaches, not with knowledge, but with faith in ritual. He drives a lancet into the lump. A scream pierces the air as blackened pus bursts forth, spilling onto the floor, the stench gagging those forced to watch. The surgeon believes the corruption has been drained. In truth, he has only opened the door wider for death. Bloodletting became the favoured cure. Veins slashed to balance the humours. Trepanation, the drilling of skulls, was prescribed for headaches and plague-induced delirium. Hot irons pressed against tumours, boils sliced open, again and again, until the patient's body was a map of cuts, burns and scars. The chronicles preserve their agony. One Italian account speaks of men begging not for the surgeon's knife, but for the priest's oil of the dying, preferring the final blessing to the futile torture of cures. Another in Paris writes of families who hid their sick from barbers and surgeons, believing that the knife quickened death rather than delayed it. And yet the madness deepened. Some surgeons prescribed the drinking of urine, believing it purified the blood. Others smeared rancid animal fat into open wounds, claiming it drew out poison. Pus was collected, stored and reapplied as if disease itself could counteract disease. It was medicine as parody, healing as cruelty. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. The people whispered, better to die untouched, to let God claim you clean, than to endure the knife that only promised a slower, more agonizing descent. The surgeon's reputation, already bloodied, rotted entirely. He was no longer seen as healer, but as executioner in disguise. And yet, thousands still submitted. Why? Because terror made them desperate. Because hope, even in its most twisted form, was clung to like a drowning man clutches driftwood. Because when the plague blackened flesh and turned lungs to rot, even the knife seemed less dreadful than waiting in silence. Picture the desperation. Mothers pressing children into the surgeon's arms, their small bodies trembling as lances split their sores. Fathers holding sons down as red-hot iron sizzled against skin. Whole households treated like carcasses upon a butcher's block, their cries mingling with the toll of funeral bells outside. And through it all, the surgeons persisted, not out of cruelty alone, but out of conviction. To them, the body was a vessel of humours, fluids in balance or imbalance. Pain was a symptom, not a warning. Bloodletting was not madness. It was science, or what passed for it. But in the streets, faith in the knife crumbled. Whispers turned to screams. Better to be taken by God than torn by men. And so, amid the ashes of plague and the rivers of blood, a question lingered. How could an entire civilization endure such horrors? The answer lies not only in the plague itself, but in their beliefs about the body, the soul, and sin. The bells of the plague years fade into silence, but the fear they carried never left. For to understand why medieval men and women endured such horrors, we must step not into the surgeon's chamber, but into the church. Christianity shaped every breath of medieval life. Illness was not random misfortune, it was punishment, a sign of sin, a test sent by God himself, to bleed, to suffer, to cry out in agony. These were not simply human torments, they were sacred offerings, proof that the soul was being purged through the body's torment. This belief carved a terrible paradox into the heart of medicine. If sickness came from God, then to cut it away was to challenge divine will. To heal through steel was not always salvation. Sometimes it was blasphemy. The church forbade its own holy men from spilling blood. Monks were forbidden to wield the knife. And so surgery fell to those beneath the cloister's shadow, barbers, executioners, men already stained with the work of death. The sacred refused the blade, leaving the profane to wield it. And yet, faith still wrapped its hand around the wound. When a patient was strapped to a table, when the saw or the hot iron descended, they did not resist. They prayed. They whispered psalms through screams. They believed their agony itself was salvation. That to endure the knife was to endure God's justice. And so, they lay still, sometimes by choice, more often by fear, believing that pain was not merely necessary but holy. Imagine the terror and resignation mixed together. A woman, her body ravaged by a tumour, kneels in prayer before submitting to the surgeon's knife. A soldier, his arm shattered by war, thanks God for the chance to endure amputation, believing his suffering mirrors Christ's passion. To bleed was to atone, to scream was to purify, to die was to be delivered. And thus the theology of pain offered both comfort and cruelty. Comfort in the promise that agony had meaning, cruelty in the silence it imposed. Who would dare resist a suffering sanctified by heaven? The knife cut flesh, but faith cut deeper. It turned screams into hymns, it turned blood into sacrament, and it allowed the surgeon's table to endure century after century, protected by doctrine, even as it left fields of corpses in its wake. But faith, however strong, could not mask the smell. The stench of rot, the oozing of wounds, the creeping blackness that spread from cut to cut. Because for every surgery that promised healing, infection waited in silence. The prayers have been said, the blade has done its work, the wound has been sealed with fire, but the true killer has not yet arrived. It waits, silent, invisible, in the blood. For in the Middle Ages, surgery did not end with the knife. It ended with infection. The surgeon's tools were never cleaned. Blades already crusted with the blood of yesterday's victims were pressed into new flesh. Hands unwashed, black with grime, poured through open wounds. Bandages were reused until they stank. And when the wound was bound, it became a prison, a sealed chamber where rot thrived. Soon came the swelling, the oozing, the heat of fever rising through the body like fire. The wound turned black, the skin split, and the stench of death seeped out long before the final breath escaped. Gangrene devoured limbs, sepsis coursed through veins. A simple cut became a death sentence. An amputation, supposedly life-saving, was more often a ritual of execution stretched out over days. Patients knew this. They had seen it. They had watched neighbours scream for weeks until their bodies collapsed from fever. They had seen soldiers who survived the battlefield only to perish on the surgeon's table. The knife promised survival, but infection offered a slower, crueler death. One chronicler wrote that to be trepanned, to have a hole carved into your skull, was less dangerous than leaving a wound untouched, and yet the truth was grimmer still. Mortality rates for amputations and skull surgeries were higher than for many untreated injuries. The body's natural healing was often safer than the surgeon's hand. Imagine the terror of knowing this, of lying on the table hearing the rasp of the saw, already tasting your death in the back of your throat. Every scream not just for the pain of cutting, but for the horror of what was to come. Not the blade, not the fire, but the slow rot, the creeping fever, the inevitable silence. This was the true face of medieval surgery, not merely crude, not merely painful, but poisoned at its core by ignorance of infection, an enemy none could see, yet all could smell. And yet, amid this darkness, strange innovations began to emerge, born not of comfort, but of desperation. from battlefields soaked in blood, from medical rebels who dared to defy tradition. Out of the stench of infection, a few dared to rebel. Men who looked upon the slaughter of surgery and asked whether blood might be spilled differently, whether agony might be harnessed rather than blindly inflicted. Henri de Mondeville, a French surgeon of the early 14th century, spoke of gentler dressings, of cleanliness, of stitching wounds rather than leaving them to fester. Guy de Chauliac, his successor, wrote vast tomes, Chirurgia Magna, describing new methods, new tools, new hopes. They were innovators, yes, but their experiments were carved into living flesh. Wars and crusades became their laboratories, battlefields, their universities. Here, under banners soaked in mud and blood, they tested. Arrows pulled from bone, limbs sawn faster, tighter, crude clamps devised to pinch arteries. Soldiers did not volunteer. They were offered by war itself. And yet, progress came hand in hand with nightmares. For curiosity too easily became cruelty. Some cut open the dying simply to observe their final heartbeats, vivisection disguised as science. Others poisoned wounds to measure how long the body resisted, and in their hunt for mercy, they brewed herbs to dull pain, mandrake, hemlock, opium, doses so crude they left patients either insensible or dead. The line between healing and torture blurred until it vanished. The surgeon became not only a butcher, but an experimenter. Every patient a subject, every chamber a theatre of both hope and horror. And yet, through these shadows, a dim light began to flicker. Whispers of antisepsis, hints of anatomy, sparks of reason pushing against centuries of blood and fire. And when Renaissance dawned, one man would drag surgery from its bloody shadows into something resembling modern science, though the price was still written in screams. The screams have long faded, the chambers of pain stand empty, and yet their echoes still haunt us. For medieval surgery was more than a nightmare. It was the foundation upon which modern medicine was built. Every blade that slipped, every wound that festered, every life extinguished upon a blood-soaked table became a lesson written in agony. Progress came, but at a cost. The cost was human. The nameless millions who endured torment in the name of healing. Mothers who prayed as the knife cut deeper. Children who screamed until their voices broke. Soldiers who survived the battlefield only to perish under the surgeon's hand. They are not remembered in monuments, nor etched upon stone. Their suffering was their contribution, their pain, the price of advancement. And though we now walk into bright sterile theatres, lit by electric lamps and guarded by science, the truth remains. We still surrender our bodies to the blade. We still place our lives in the hands of strangers who cut us open in hope, not certainty. The fear that once filled medieval chambers has not vanished. It has merely been clothed in white gowns and stainless steel. This is the legacy of fear, a history carved into flesh, sanctified by faith and preserved in silence. It is a reminder that civilization itself is fragile, that beneath the marble of progress there is always blood. If this journey into history's shadows has opened your eyes to the fragility of civilization, subscribe for more untold stories that the world tried to bury.